So I thought I'd kick off by just, first of all, congratulating you on this award for economics, politics, and business environment with your case IKEA in Saudi Arabia. It's a real peer review process, we think, because it's not based on numbers of sales, this award. It's based on the number of different educators and schools at which your case is adopted. So really those educators are judging you by the currency that's most valuable, which is their time and effort and the well-being of their class and their students. So I think it's a real compliment to the strength of the case that you should be coming out on top and receiving the award. And congratulations, it's an excellent case and really, really well worth investigating further. I'd like to start by asking you, what is the case about? Could you tell us a little bit about the background of the case and what first sparked your interest and led to you writing it?
So this is a case that we wrote for the MBA program at the Harvard Business School, in particular for a required course called Leadership and Corporate Accountability. And the course itself deals with the responsibilities of business leaders to beyond investors, to their customers, to employees, and then to society at large, and how to calibrate and contextualize that responsibility across time and across geographies. And this particular case was written for a submodule on responsibilities to society. And what made this case really interesting to us was the fact that IKEA has a very strong brand position and image as a company that's on the leading edge of progressive values, almost an ambassador for Sweden in the world and for Swedish and Scandinavian values in the world. And yet somehow it was caught perhaps behind the curve on this in the context of Saudi Arabia. So long story short, they got into Saudi Arabia in the early 1980s at a time when the political environment was very different. And because of restrictions on the depiction of women in print catalogs, and because their models in their catalogs were largely Scandinavians dressed in attire that Scandinavians would dress in, they thought perhaps the wise solution there would be to airbrush all women out of the catalog. And maybe that was a wise idea at some point in time, but it certainly wasn't wise in 2012 as they were caught out. And so the issue in the case is really, how do you track the progress or the development of values in society as a company? And therefore, how do you stay ahead of them? Particularly if in the context of a company like IKEA, your brand is about a certain kind of liberal values in society.
Yeah, this all sounds very familiar, especially working in the Middle East between Dubai, Saudi Arabia, GCC, where these kinds of conversations come up on a regular basis when Western companies would enter the region and would face the question of where to draw the line between what's a culturally sensitive approach versus what is not okay. And I think this case hits right, the right nerve when it comes to that particular question, particularly because different perspective, if you take different perspectives, that yields different outcomes on whether that decision was wise, as Professor Karthik mentioned, or not. And the context back then in 2012, where Saudi Arabia was as well in a very different place than where it is today, also yields very interesting conversations, as you might have noticed, Professor, in the many different classes where you've taught this case.
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about those many different classes.
So the case continues to be taught, in my understanding, in the Leadership and Corporate Accountability course at Harvard, and indeed in many other business schools around the world. But my current role is the director of the Master of Public Policy program at Oxford. And I actually just taught a version of this case last week here in the MPP program. It resonates deeply in part because as public policy leaders who we seek to educate here at the Blavatnik School, the focus is really about what is the role of government in designing the rules and norms around business engagement, not just for businesses operating in your country, but also for businesses from your jurisdiction operating elsewhere. And 3 weeks before that, I taught the case actually in an exec ed program at Oxford's Business School, which was largely executives from the Gulf region. So this was a custom program for executives in that part of the world. And as you can imagine, as Marc said earlier, the case resonates deeply because this is, of course, the issues they're dealing with their clients and with the companies they work for, as to how far ahead can they afford to be. Most of these executives are, in fact, representatives of a global community of individuals who share fairly global values, but they serve customers in deeply local settings. And so the question for them is always, we want to be at the leading edge of change, but to quote Mandela on this, you can't be so far ahead that nobody's following you. And so I think we've given the variety of settings in which we've taught it, it struck me that it's resonated, whether it's business leaders, whether it's exec ed, whether it's the MBA, in part because it's just such a live issue. And I think over the last couple of years, or more than couple now, about 5 years, we've experienced perhaps a slowing pace in globalization. Some would argue we're even experiencing an era of deglobalization. And that has given this case perhaps a new lease of life, because when we first wrote this case 10 years ago, it seemed like the world was on this sort of inevitable march towards a global convergence in values. And that seems much less likely today. And so, in fact, I found over time, over the last 10 years of teaching this case, it's also become somewhat more interesting, because now the question is not that we're eventually going to get there, but we might never get there. So we've got to be especially careful about this gap we're creating between our customers in one country versus another.
Now, there were 3 of you working on this case. I'm intrigued by how that kind of team authorship works in practice. Did you have shared values? Did you have disagreements about the approach? Well, just generally, how did the writing process work for you?
I was sitting in Boston, and Marc was, of course, sitting in the Middle East and traveling regularly to Saudi Arabia. And Jérôme was in Paris, but in regular contact with IKEA in Sweden. So they should really speak to this issue.
I'm Lebanese, so Lebanon's considered one of the more liberal countries in the Middle East. However, working in the rest of the region, definitely I'm exposed to the different cultures, and that creates 2 types of people in this region. One, the culturally sensitive and appreciative of the different cultures, and 2, some form of resistance and kind of disacknowledgement for these differences. I'm more on the former camp than the latter. Working in this region for the last 10, 15 years, I created some form of cultural sensitivity. So when I started working on this case, Professor Karthik and Jérôme had already a few weeks or a few days of writings before I had joined. And the interesting thing, coming on board, I came from the perspective as wanting to represent the region in this case, even though perhaps I'm not from Saudi Arabia. However, due to my work and knowledge and acquaintances and friends in the region, I felt a sense of obligation to represent the region, which I think brought in some form of a balance to the case, especially that, even though I'm sure all of us wanted this case to be balanced, but our upbringing and our surroundings brings a different perspective to the case. And I remember the first time I read the drafts that Professor Karthik and Jérôme had written, I had some form of, reaction, personal reaction, where few words caught me off guard. I don't recall which ones exactly, But I remember that these words were not words that I would have chosen in that particular context. And that's where we went back and forth, and it took a bit more time to reach a place where we would feel this case is objective. Because getting to an objectivity while having these different perspectives is very hard, versus just having an objectivity for someone living in Boston or someone living in Paris. And that, I think, was quite interesting to me personally, as I was just starting on that job and caught between, the different perspectives for this case.
Yes, indeed. No, I must I must agree with Marc. It was a really interesting process. To come back to your question on why we were three people, writing this case and the different perspectives. I think, as you said, Marc, we started writing this case with public material and material from IKEA. And so, I would say, quite automatically, we had more perspective, coming from the company. And we've been used to working with, large companies, and especially IKEA, which is very liberal and very progressive company. So we were kind of using, the same terms, and perhaps that's what, caught Marc off guard. The same terms and the same, I would say, terminology used in all the articles, the public material, talking about this issue for IKEA in Saudi Arabia. So I think, coming from that place and also being in Paris, and being used to working with companies. So perhaps, using the same, the material from companies, I think it was very useful to have Marc coming and really, put us in front of, the contradictions, or perhaps I would say the limits of the method we had been using before.
Yeah, no, I think the case itself, the fact that you can teach it to, a group of American executives or a group of executives from Saudi Arabia, and you can have a rich discussion about the issues in the case, and people don't get tied into, semantics about word choice and so forth. That is testimony to the incredible job that Marc and Jérôme have done in putting this together, because the idea is to be able to get that learning objective across in the classroom without letting the case become the distraction, because there's a rich enough set of issues here. But of course, what often happens, a couple of days ago, I was teaching in another course where I assigned some reading by Sam Huntington, who is, as you may know, a very well-known but somewhat divisive political theorist. And of course, there's a rich set of ideas about Huntington that Huntington raises to discuss. But it's very hard to assign something from Huntington and not have the conversation dissolve into one about Huntington himself. And that's, of course, the complete opposite of what you want in a case method classroom. And so that's why I think having the multinational, multicultural writing team, really, it's very worth it. And I remember Marc calling up some friends in Saudi Arabia and word checking paragraphs with them and saying, and the whole process was just it was worth it in the end. The fact that you can still teach it 10 years later suggests that it was worth it.
So I get a really strong sense in talking to you about how well the team worked together in writing the case, and it certainly worked today in this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and congratulations again on producing a case where I think I get a real sense that maybe it's a case whose time has come, because it's addressing issues that we're all looking at all around the world in so many different areas. So congratulations.
Thank you, Richard. And I just want to also thank two people who are not on this call, Essel Chekin, who worked with Marc, and Vincent Dessin, who worked with Jérôme, because they were instrumental behind the scenes in getting a lot of the things that were necessary to make this case happen.